There is a specific kind of report that keeps surfacing out of western Alaska, and it does not come from biologists or wildlife agencies. It comes from hunters checking a trail camera days after the fact, from a fisherman working a river mouth at dusk who glimpses something low and orange moving through willow scrub, from a village elder describing tracks in fresh snow that do not match anything a lifetime spent on that land had prepared them to recognize. None of these people are reporting a bear. None of them are reporting a wolf. What they keep describing in isolated accounts that rarely reach each other is something that should not exist anywhere near that coastline at all: a tiger. Alaska has never had tigers. Not historically, not in the fossil record anyone takes seriously, not in any field guide printed in the last century. Its large predator guild is bears, wolves, and on the rare southern fringe, a wandering mountain lion pushing further than expected. Generations of hunters and trappers built their entire working understanding of danger in that landscape around those three animals, learning to read their tracks, their scat, the particular way each one moves through brush, without ever needing to account for anything else. The idea of a striped apex cat moving through spruce and muskeg sounds, on its face, like exactly the kind of story that spreads because it is compelling rather than because it is true. And for most of the time, these reports have circulated in hunting forums and small-town social media groups. That dismissal has been the reasonable one. What complicates that easy dismissal is that the people producing these accounts are, disproportionately, exactly the people you would expect to get an identification right. These are not casual tourists photographing something blurry through a bus window. They are hunters who have spent decades reading sign in that country, guides who make their living on precisely this kind of observational accuracy, village residents who grew up learning to tell a bear track from a wolf track before they learned much else about the land around them. When someone with that background insists what they saw did not match anything they already knew, that insistence carries a different weight than an unfamiliar visitor's excited guess. It does not make the report true. It does make it harder to file away as simple inexperience. And the geography and the biology sitting underneath the story turn out to be less absurd than the story itself sounds on first hearing, which is the real reason this deserves a closer look rather than an immediate dismissal. The animal at the center of these reports is the Amur tiger, sometimes called the Siberian tiger, the largest wildcat alive today. Its only confirmed wild population sits in the Russian Far East, concentrated in the forests of Primorsky and Khabarovsk, across the narrow stretch of water that separates that coastline from the westernmost edge of Alaska. For most of the last century, that population was in serious trouble, reduced by hunting and habitat loss to a fraction of its historic range, clinging to survival in isolated pockets of forest. What has changed, quietly and largely outside public attention, is that the population has been recovering, and recovering faster than most people paying casual attention to conservation news would assume. A range-wide winter track survey conducted across that region counted several hundred individual tigers, a substantial increase over the previous full census taken years earlier. In the southwestern portion of Primorsky province specifically, researchers documented the local population more than doubling within roughly 7 years. That is not a marginal recovery. That is a population running out of room. Forests that once held tigers at low density, scattered thinly across enormous home ranges, are now approaching something closer to carrying capacity, the ecological ceiling, past which the landscape simply cannot support more animals without displacement beginning to occur. What happens next follows a pattern well documented in large cat biology generally, tigers specifically included. When a population nears carrying capacity, established adult males hold their territories, and it is the younger males, not yet strong enough to challenge for ground already claimed, who get pushed outward, not toward the center of good habitat, which is already occupied, but toward the margins, the unclaimed edges, wherever an unestablished animal can find space that nobody else wants badly enough to defend. Wildlife researchers tracking Amur tiger movement have documented individual young males traveling extraordinary distances during this kind of dispersal, in some recorded cases well over 1,000 kilometers from the territory where they were born, wandering through unfamiliar country in search of anywhere they might eventually settle and hold ground of their own. Extend that pattern of directionless, pressure-driven wandering far enough north and east, and the geography starts to matter in a way that most people never think to consider. The Bering Strait, the stretch of ocean separating the Russian Far East from Alaska, is not the vast oceanic barrier the word ocean tends to suggest in the imagination. At its narrowest point, it measures a little over 3.5 kilometers across, a distance that would be an unremarkable swim for a species built the way tigers are built. Tigers are strong, willing swimmers by nature, documented crossing rivers and stretches of open water that most people would assume were impossible for a land predator of that size. Confirmed accounts exist of individual tigers swimming distances exceeding 25 kilometers in open water. A 3.5 kilometer strait, under the right conditions, does not stretch credibility nearly as far as it first appears to. And the conditions matter, because the strait does not stay open water year-round. Every winter, ice forms across large sections of it, at times closing the gap almost entirely into something closer to a frozen land bridge than an open crossing. A dispersing tiger, driven by nothing more complicated than population pressure and an animal's basic drive to find unclaimed territory, would not need to be a strong swimmer in the coldest months at all. It would simply need to be willing to keep walking. No wildlife agency on either side of that strait has confirmed a tiger crossing into Alaska. No photograph submitted from any of these reports has been independently verified. That absence of confirmed evidence matters and should not be minimized, but it also does not settle the question the way a flat dismissal implies it does, because the honest state of the evidence sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. The physical capability for a crossing has arguably never been more clearly present, at the same time that not a single piece of confirmed proof exists that one has actually happened. The practical effect of that uncertainty has already reached daily life in some of the more remote coastal communities in small, almost administrative ways that rarely make it into any formal record. Outfitters running late-season hunts in the western part of the state describe fielding a question from clients, now that would have sounded strange a few seasons ago, people wanting to know, half joking and half not, whether there is any truth to the tiger stories before they commit to a trip into the backcountry. A handful of guides have started carrying a slightly different mental checklist on remote trips, not because they expect to encounter anything, but because enough clients now ask about it that having an honest answer ready has become part of the job. None of this amounts to institutional alarm. Wildlife officials have not changed any policy, issued any advisory, or altered how backcountry permits are handled. What has changed is smaller and stranger than that, a kind of low background awareness that has crept into ordinary conversation in a handful of communities, the same way any persistent local rumor eventually does, whether or not it turns out to be true. Three explanations tend to surface whenever these accounts are taken seriously enough to examine rather than dismissed outright, and none of them agree cleanly with each other about what is actually being seen out there. The first explanation takes the reports essentially at face value. Under this reading, population pressure in the Russian Far East has reached the point where dispersal events pushing individual animals into genuinely unprecedented territory are not just theoretically possible, but increasingly likely. And Alaska, close enough and connected enough by winter ice, is exactly the kind of unclaimed edge a directionless young male might eventually wander into. Supporters of this explanation point to the timing, noting that the clearest cluster of unconfirmed reports has emerged in roughly the same window as the population surveys, documenting the sharpest recent growth in the source population across the strait, a correlation that on its own proves nothing, but becomes harder to wave away as pure coincidence the more consistently it repeats. The second explanation is considerably more mundane and, if it is right, requires no unprecedented wildlife event at all. Alaska's own landscape already contains large predators capable of producing an ambiguous, adrenaline-colored account from a distance in poor light at the edge of a clearing. A lynx catching evening sun at an unusual angle, a wolf with an atypical coat pattern, even in rare cases an escaped or released exotic animal from private ownership somewhere far outside its legal range, could all plausibly generate a report that gets remembered afterward as something far more dramatic than what was actually glimpsed. Under this theory, nothing genuinely new is moving through Alaska at all. What has changed is only the interpretation applied afterward to an old, familiar kind of fleeting encounter. Supporters of this second explanation point out that misidentification of large predators is a documented, recurring phenomenon everywhere large carnivores overlap with human observers, not a phenomenon unique to Alaska or unique to this particular rumor. Wildlife officials elsewhere have spent years fielding confident reports of animals that turned out, once properly investigated, to be an entirely ordinary species seen under unusual circumstances. Under this reading, nothing about the current wave of Alaska reports requires anything exceptional to be happening in the landscape at all. It only requires an old, familiar kind of mistaken observation, now filtered through a story dramatic enough that people remember it differently once they already know what they are supposedly looking for. The third explanation concerns itself less with the animal and more with how these accounts travel once they exist. A single ambiguous report, once posted to a hunting forum or shared inside a small community social media group, tends not to stay isolated for long. It gets repeated, embellished in small ways with each retelling, and eventually cross-referenced against other equally uncertain sightings that may have nothing genuinely in common with it beyond both involving something large, orange, and briefly seen. Under this theory, the pattern itself is manufactured after the fact, less a signal of something real moving through the landscape, and more a demonstration of how quickly an appealing story can self-assemble out of disconnected, individually inconclusive fragments, once enough people start looking for confirmation of something they already suspect might be out there. Researchers who study large carnivore dispersal tend to resist collapsing this into one tidy answer, and the reason is that each explanation accounts for part of the picture without cleanly covering all of it. The population data from the Russian Far East is real, verifiable, and does correlate suggestively with the timing of these reports, which argues against dismissing the entire pattern as pure misidentification. At the same time, the complete absence of a single verified photograph, scat sample, or confirmed track across years of scattered reports is difficult to reconcile with a genuinely established, repeatedly observed presence, which argues just as strongly against taking every account at face value. And the amplification theory, while clearly playing some role in how widely these stories now circulate, cannot fully explain why the specific character of the reports, hunters and longtime residents, rather than casual tourists, keeps repeating across communities that have little contact with each other and no obvious reason to be echoing the same story on purpose. What official wildlife agencies in Alaska have said publicly on the matter has been consistently, almost pointedly cautious. No confirmed sighting exists on record. No formal investigation has been opened. Biologists asked directly tend to acknowledge that a crossing is not biologically impossible, while stopping well short of suggesting it has actually occurred, a position that sounds evasive until you consider it is simply the most honest answer available, given the current state of the evidence. Longtime residents in some of the more remote communities along the western coast describe the reports themselves with a similar lack of alarm, treating them less as an emerging crisis and more as one more unresolved oddity layered onto a landscape that has always held things nobody could fully explain, spoken about in the same practical, unhurried tone used to discuss unusual weather or an unusually early freeze. What remains genuinely unresolved, and may stay that way for a long time, is which of these three forces is doing the most work, or whether they are even separate explanations at all, rather than overlapping pressures acting on the same uncertain pattern simultaneously. A population under real pressure across the strait may be producing dispersers capable of a crossing nobody has yet managed to document with certainty. An old familiar predator, seen briefly in poor conditions, may be getting reinterpreted through the lens of a story people now already know to expect, and a handful of genuinely ambiguous encounters, retold and cross-referenced enough times, may have quietly assembled themselves into something that reads like a pattern without ever actually being one. There is no clean resolution to this one. No single photograph, no single confirmed track, no formal statement from a wildlife agency that settles the question one way or the other. What exists instead is a landscape that has always demanded a certain humility from the people who spend real time in it. A place where the boundary between what is known and what merely seems plausible has never been as fixed as a map or a field guide wants to suggest. People who have spent their whole lives in that part of Alaska tend not to describe the uncertainty with much anxiety, and that measured reaction says something about how the region actually relates to a landscape it already knows keeps some things unexplained. Longtime residents talk about the tiger reports the way they talk about anything else genuinely unresolved out there. A scarce salmon run, an unusually warm winter, a hunting season that behaves nothing like the one before it, filed away as one more variable in a place that has never fully let itself be mapped with certainty. Nobody is organizing search parties. Nobody in an official capacity is treating this as an emergency. The story simply sits there, quietly, refusing to resolve itself in either direction, neither confirmed nor disproven, exactly the kind of loose thread a landscape this size seems to specialize in producing and never quite tying off. The strait narrows to a few kilometers in the coldest months. The forests across it are producing more young, unsettled animals than they used to, animals with nowhere established left to go, and every biological incentive to keep moving until they find somewhere that is. And somewhere in that overlap between hard population data and a story that keeps circulating without ever quite proving itself, Western Alaska is being asked to sit with the possibility of an animal it has never officially had, and may never be able to say for certain whether it does. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.